They were just finishing dinner when the doorbell rang. 12-year-old Lori jumped up to answer the door before her father or brother could get up, but quickly returned to the dining room with a perplexed look on her face. "It's a policeman, Daddy. He wants to talk to you," she informed him. Frank was seized with fear, but he tried his best to hide it from his children. When he got to the door, he saw that the caller was actually a Georgia State police officer. "Are you Frank Parker?" the policeman asked. "Yes," Frank confirmed. "Are you Meredith Parker's husband?" When Frank nodded, the policeman looked at the two children and said, "May I speak to you privately, Mr. Parker?" Frank felt his throat constrict and had to clear it before he could speak. "Bobby, Lori, please go to your rooms. I need to talk to the officer alone." Both children started to protest, but when their father barked at them, "Now!" they jumped up and hastily obeyed. They were not used to hearing such a tone of voice. As soon as the children left the room, the officer turned to their father again. "Mr. Parker, I have been asked to give you some bad news. Your wife's airplane is missing and presumed shot down. It disappeared from radar tonight about halfway between Miami International Airport and Nassau. A Coast Guard ship is now in the area looking for survivors." The facts were simple enough. Serving as a vice president of regional sales for a major international corporation, Meredith traveled with the region's CFO to the headquarters in the Bahamas. She was an experienced pilot of a small airplane, so the 180-mile flight to Nassau should have been routine. Frank hadn't given it much thought when Meredith had called and informed him of her plans. Now he was distraught. This was his worst nightmare. His wife's plane had crashed at night in the shark-infested waters of the Caribbean. The officer gave a few more details that didn't reassure Frank at all, and promised that the Coast Guard would call in the morning or sooner if there was any news. No sooner had the door closed behind the policeman than Bobby and Lori ran up to him with concerned faces and began asking questions that their father couldn't answer. Frank knew they were eavesdropping. He'd be eavesdropping too if he were in their shoes. They huddled together, each trying to find encouraging words to say to the other. Lori began to cry, and though he tried to be brave, Bobby's eyes turned red as well. Frank tried his best to stay calm for the sake of his children, but inside he was beyond furious. Doing the dishes or homework was out of the question. They spent the rest of the evening at arm's length from each other. It was past the time when the children usually went to bed, but there was still no phone call. Finally, exhausted by the late hour and their fears, all three of them moved into the bedroom, and the children fell asleep with their father for the first time since they were small and afraid of thunderstorms. The next morning, they were already up and trying to eat breakfast when the Coast Guard called. The faint hope engendered by the call was quickly extinguished when the officer informed Frank that a boat combing the area had found nothing. Frank called the principal of the middle school the children attended and explained to her why Bobby and Lori would be absent that day. He went to check on them, but found them sitting in front of the television watching a CNN report on the missing airplane. Frank wasn't sure whether he should let them watch further or turn off the TV, but no sooner had he made up his mind than the phone rang again. And from then on, as soon as Frank hung up after one call, another one came in. Not surprisingly, Meredith's parents and his own were the first to call. They were all extremely concerned, but they all tried to exude false optimism, hoping that she would miraculously be found. Frank promised to call back immediately with any news. Then followed calls from Meredith's friends and coworkers. All of them wanted to say or do something to help, but none of them had any idea how to do it. The conversations were short and awkward. The most difficult of all were the calls from members of the media. He should have expected them, but Frank was caught off guard when the first reporter called and talked to him much longer than he wanted to. Then other media outlets started calling, and as Frank realized what was going on, he began screening out all the calls and answering only those from people close to him. During all this activity, a whole procession of neighbors and friends began arriving at the door of the house with condolences and food. At first, their generosity was appreciated, as Frank had no energy to cook, but soon he and his children had more food than they could eat in a week. It was an old Southern tradition to express concern and condolences with food, but while Frank appreciated the gesture, every roast and casserole was a bitter reminder that his wife, with whom he had lived for 20 years, was almost certainly dead. The next few days were horrible. The Parks found themselves practically prisoners in their own home, held together only by a desire not to deal with other people and the hope of some news from the Coast Guard. Frank called the Miami office daily for updates, but the reports were always negative. Then 5 days after a state trooper showed up on their doorstep, The long-awaited news arrived. A Coast Guard officer called to inform Frank that the wreckage of his wife's plane had been found. There was no sign of survivors. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer said, "but we're forced to cease search and rescue efforts at this time." Frank wanted only one thing, to hide and mourn alone. But there was no such opportunity. Instead, an endless list of responsibilities fell upon him, and all of them were excruciating. The worst, of course, was breaking the sad news to Bobby and Lori and trying to comfort them. When they finally calmed down, he had to call relatives and close friends to let them know. Then he called their church to organize a memorial service, then the newspaper to write an obituary. More calls followed to let them know the time and date of the service. By the time he finished the work, Frank felt physically and emotionally drained. Somehow, the family survived the service and began the slow, painful process of returning to normalcy. The children returned to school the following week, and the return to a routine seemed to help a little. Frank was less fortunate. He now had a whole new set of responsibilities. At the urging of a friend, Frank went to a lawyer to find out what his legal responsibilities were. He was shocked to learn that he would have to apply for a death certificate. "But her plane crashed at sea," he protested. "How can there be any doubt?" "I know," the lawyer lamented, "but in the absence of a body and a doctor's certificate, the court has to make an official declaration." "Do I really have to wait 7 years?" Frank asked vexedly. "No," the lawyer assured him. "In cases like this one, where a person has gone missing at sea, there are not usually significant delays. After the attack on the World Trade Center, death certificates were issued within days, although some bodies were never identified. You may have to answer some questions, but these cases are usually resolved very quickly." "I can draft a petition for you," the attorney continued. "I can also help you amend all the other documents." When Frank looked at him puzzled, the lawyer said, "You know, like joint bank accounts, mortgages, insurance, car titles, wills, anything. While I'm at it, you need to get in touch with your wife's company and find out what benefits you're entitled to and get all your personal belongings." Frank shook his head tiredly. In his grief, he couldn't stop thinking about how hard it would be to destroy the life he and his wife had shared. Now he had one more thing to do that he dreaded. Call the widow of John Collier, the CFO who was on the plane with Meredith. Frank had only met Collier a couple of times at his wife's company events, but he immediately disliked the executive. In Frank's opinion, Collier was one of those narcissistic types who think they are smarter than everyone else. In the short time Frank had spent with him, Collier had managed to list enough names and boast of his accomplishments to leave a bad taste in Frank's mouth. But it wasn't his widow's fault, Frank reminded himself, and he felt it his duty to contact her. Frank called, and Amanda Collier was already waiting for him. As they exchanged condolences, Frank realized that she was probably the only one who truly understood his feelings. As they settled into her living room, she asked affectionately, "How are you now, Frank?" "I'm having a hard time, Amanda. A very hard time. I just can't come to terms with the fact that she's really gone. So many things remind me of her." He shook his head helplessly. "You know what the hardest part is? When I'm on the street or in a crowd of people, I keep thinking I've noticed her. The other day, I must have scared some poor woman half to death when I caught up with her because I thought it was Meredith." He stared at the floor, recalling the memory and his emotions when he realized what he was doing. Amanda looked at him sympathetically. She knew that no words would help. Finally, he looked up at her. "And you, Amanda, how are you doing?" "It's not easy, Frank, but I'll manage," she told him. "To tell you the truth, I'm probably coping a lot better than you are. John and I didn't have children, so I don't have two to comfort them the way you do. Besides, and I wouldn't say this to anyone else, John and I didn't really get along before all this happened. I've caught him having affairs a couple times in the past, and I think he was in the middle of one. If that hadn't happened, we probably would have been headed for divorce a long time ago." "I'm sorry to hear that, Amanda," Frank told her sympathetically. "I can only imagine the conflicting emotions you're feeling." "Yes," she agreed. "One moment I'm relieved that I won't have to deal with his cheating anymore, and the next I'm feeling guilty because I'm not getting any sadder. And no matter what, some part of me still misses him." "Are you going to be okay financially?" Frank asked, trying to change the subject. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "The good news is that the company took out life insurance on Frank's life, and since he died while on a business trip under the double indemnity clause, I'll get twice the face value. The bad news is that I'm going to need every penny of that money because I found out that Frank made a series of bad investments in the futures market and severely depleted our assets. What Amanda said about her late husband didn't surprise Frank. He couldn't believe that an egotist like John Collier could have been anything but a faithful husband. Besides, the idea that Collier fancied himself a market trader was entirely consistent with Frank's ideas of the man. Frank's attention was drawn to Amanda's mention of life insurance paid for by the company. He remembered his lawyer's advice and made a mental note to contact Meredith's benefits department immediately. If Collier was insured, Meredith should have life insurance too, and until he found a job, those funds might come in handy. After chatting for a few more minutes, Frank rose from the couch. Amanda, please forgive me, but I have to cut my visit short. Billy and Lori will be home from school soon, and I need to pick them both up. But please stay in touch, and if there is anything I can do to help, even if you just need to duck your head, please don't hesitate to call me. When Frank pulled up to their house after picking up Bobby and Lori, he was surprised to see a car parked out front. Frank led the kids into the house through the garage, and a minute later the doorbell rang. A man in his 50s and a young woman in a business suit stood in front of the door. I'm Special Agent Harold Barnes, the man introduced himself. And this is Special Agent Celia Murray. We're with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to stop by and ask you a few questions in connection with your wife's disappearance. Realizing that the two men were law enforcement officers, Lori wrapped her arms around her father's waist and buried her face in his side. Frank felt her tears wet his shirt and pulled her tightly against him. What does that mean? He demanded angrily. Before the first agent could speak, Agent Murray stepped into the conversation. I'm very sorry we've upset your daughter, Mr. Parker. All we're trying to do is run a routine check on your application for Mrs. Parker's death certificate. If you'd like us to come back later, we'll try to do it at your convenience. Frank ignored her and turned to face his daughter. It's okay, sweetheart. Nothing terrible has happened. The female agent dropped dramatically to one knee, reached into her purse, pulled out a napkin, and held it out to the girl. Here, honey, she said in a gentle voice. Lori, hesitating, timidly accepted the napkin, wiped her eyes, and then blew her nose. When Frank saw that his daughter had calmed down, he put his arm around her and spoke to her. These people need to talk to me about your mom, Lori. Why don't you go and start doing your homework? I'll be here in the living room if you need me. With those words, he gave the 12-year-old a gentle nudge in the direction of her room. He then turned to face the officers. If it won't take long, let's try to get this over with. The three of them walked to the living room and settled around the coffee table. We need to get some information on your wife, Mr. Parker, the male agent began. How long have you been married? We got married in 1990, right after graduating from the University of Georgia, Frank replied, remembering the beautiful brunette he had conquered so many years before. And she worked for International Marketing Corporation before she disappeared? That's right, Frank confirmed. She was vice president of sales for the southeastern United States. If her region is the southeast, why would she go to the Bahamas? A younger woman asked. At IMC, Frank explained. The southeast included Puerto Rico and the Caribbean as well as the United States. Their Caribbean headquarters was in Nassau, so Mary often had to fly there. Mary? The woman asked. Frank felt his voice grow hoarse. Mary was my pet name for her. Agent Murray reached out and patted him sympathetically on the shoulder. It's all right, Mr. Parker. I know this is hard for you. The senior agent decided to change the line of questioning. Was it normal for your wife to fly her own airplane on business trips? Yes, Frank replied. Mary's father was a pilot, and she got her license as soon as she was old enough. She took every opportunity to fly herself because, she said, it made her independent of the commercial airlines' schedules. She could get where she needed to go, complete her business, and return home while her competitors were still stuck in the terminal, she said. She felt that gave her an advantage, especially when she was just starting out. Both agents took notes, then Agent Murray looked up at him. What about you, Mr. Parker? What do you do? Frank managed a smile. I'm a house husband. Noticing their looks, he continued. I was an aerospace engineer until 3 years ago when my company downsized and I was laid off. The only chance of finding a new job would have required me to move out of state. But in the meantime, things were going well for Mary. She had gotten several big promotions and was making a great salary plus big bonuses. It didn't make sense for her to quit her job, so we agreed that I would run the household and take care of the kids while she worked. And how did this change affect your relationship with Miss Parker? Agent Barnes asked. What does that have to do with it? Frank asked irritably. Please bear with us, Mr. Parker, the younger woman interjected. We need to find out if any factors played a role in your wife's disappearance. This is routine procedure. Calming down a bit, Frank looked at them both. Of course, this was a big change for me, but I'm an engineer. I was taught to measure and evaluate all factors in a design. It was easy for me to see that a change in role was what was needed for our family at that moment. I let Mary devote himself to his career and made sure Bobby and Lori were always close to their parents. Neither agent said anything, and it seemed to Frank that the question hung in the air that way. I don't mean to say it was easy, he continued. She was always calling clients or going to meetings at the corporation, so I didn't see her as often as I would have liked. Sometimes I felt like her work came first, and he suddenly realized what he was saying and added hastily, but that's quite common in corporate life. Besides, things were going well, and he caught himself that things were going well so far. Two more questions, Mr. Parker, Agent Barnes said. Did you notice any changes in your wife's behavior in the period leading up to her disappearance? Not really, Frank answered after a moment's thought. I know there was a lot of pressure on her in the last year or so, and her travel schedule was tighter than ever. But Mary said she was in line for a serious promotion. When she got it, she promised that the new job would reduce her travel, put her in a management position, and give her a substantial pay raise. One last question, Agent Barnes said, making notes in his notebook. Are you aware of any changes in your finances that your wife may have made in the last few months? No, Frank answered confidently. I keep track of all our finances and haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary. The young woman glanced at her partner. I think we've taken up enough of your time, Mr. Parker. We'll be able to wrap things up fairly quickly and we'll let you know as soon as we're done. In the meantime, if you think of anything you think we should know, give me a call at this number. Having said that, she handed him her business card and the two agents headed for the door. Frank went back to his children's bedrooms to make sure they had done their homework. When he peeked into their rooms, both looked busy. They're strong kids, he thought. They've been through hell and are holding up well no matter what. The next day, Frank went to IMC headquarters to visit the benefits department. The head of the department met him, and after expressing her condolences, handed him a box of Meredith's personal effects from her office. Frank had to swallow when he saw the framed family portrait she kept on her desk. The principal then directed him to the specialist who was to advise him on Meredith's benefits. The first thing he did was examine Meredith's 401k account. Frank regularly read her annual reports, so he didn't expect any surprises. However, when he saw the total amount, it was much higher than he expected. Apparently, Meredith had increased her contributions to her retirement fund over the past year, even more than she was entitled to from the company. She was really trying to provide for her family, the specialist commented admiringly. The specialist further advised Frank to withdraw the funds as soon as possible and roll them into his own IRA so that he could more easily manage the funds. Another surprise for Frank was the worksheet he received describing the insurance benefit he would receive as Meredith's beneficiary. He learned that Meredith had chosen the maximum amount of insurance to which she was entitled. With the accidental death factor factored in, Frank realized with amazement that he would receive Meredith's income for nearly 4 years. The insurance company will pay that amount in annual installments, the woman explained. Otherwise, the taxes will eat you alive. Of course, payment of all benefits was contingent on the company receiving a copy of Meredith's death certificate. But after the visit from the two GBI agents, Frank was confident that it would happen soon. Frank left the office building with a huge sigh of relief. He had thought he would have to start looking for another job immediately, but now realized that he had a significant reprieve to get his life in order. Thank you, Mary, he whispered fervently. A few days later, Frank was preparing dinner for his family in the late afternoon when the doorbell rang. When Frank went to answer it, Special Agent Murray appeared on the doorstep. After he invited her in, she explained the purpose of her visit. Mr. Parker, Frank, I wanted to personally inform you that our investigation is complete and that your wife's death certificate has been issued. You should receive a copy from the court in the mail in the next few days. Frank breathed a sigh of relief. He had believed that there would be no problem, but it was nice to know that this important task had been accomplished. At that moment, a panicked scream came from the back of the house, and Frank was surprised to hear Lori's voice. "Daddy, help me! Help me!" He turned and rushed into Lori's room. Celia Murray followed at his heels, her hand reaching for the service revolver in a shoulder holster under her jacket. When Frank burst into Lori's room, he saw his daughter looking at the large red blood stain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy," she wailed. Frank was horrified. "What happened, Lori? Did you cut yourself?" As he headed toward his daughter, someone's hand grabbed his elbow and pulled him back with sudden force. "Let me handle this," Celia said firmly and pushed him toward the door. He protested, but the young woman didn't back down. "I'll handle it, Frank. Just go out into the living room and wait." Something commanding in her voice made him pause, and when the determined young woman blocked his path, he hesitantly retreated into the hallway. Celia calmly closed the door in his face. 15 anxious minutes later, the door opened and Celia appeared on the threshold. Before Frank could ask a question, she grabbed his arm. "Lori is fine. You need to go to the store right now and buy a pack of sanitary napkins. Get the smallest size." "But Lori, Bobby," he began to protest. "I'll take care of Lori and let Bobby know what's going on. You, on the other hand, need to go to the store and get back here as soon as possible," she said. As Frank drove to the nearest store, it hit him and he started berating himself. "She's menstruating, you idiot. You should have realized it right away." On the way back, he cursed himself for never talking to his daughter about growing up and becoming a woman. "Oh, Mary, I need you more than ever," he thought, feeling sorry for himself. When he got home, Celia met him at the front door and snatched the package from him. Looking at the package, she smiled. "You did good, Daddy." She then disappeared into Lori's room. Another 30 minutes later, Celia reappeared, hugging Lori, who somewhat timidly pulled away. Frank knelt down and hugged his daughter as she came toward him. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you about this a long time ago. I just hadn't thought about it." "It's okay, Daddy," the girl spoke up. "I just didn't realize what was going on and I got scared. Celia explained it all to me. Now I know what to do." As she spoke, she took Celia's hand and Frank realized that his daughter had a new friend. He stood up and turned to Celia. "Thank you so much. It's good to have you here. I must have panicked for a moment." He looked at his daughter. "I'm afraid I'm not very good with girls." Celia smiled, but no sooner had she finished speaking than Bobby popped out from around the corner. "If my stupid little sister has first period, does that mean we're not having dinner tonight? I'm starving." "Bobby!" Lori shrieked, but Frank grabbed her before she could pounce on her big brother. "Bobby, if you talk to your sister like that again, I guarantee you'll go to bed hungry," Frank warned his son. But before his threat sounded too ominous, he continued, "Now go wash your hands and set the table." Then he turned to Celia again. "The least we can do is offer you a meal for all you've done. It's not exactly a gourmet dinner, but it will be something to eat." The young woman was visibly embarrassed. "Thank you, but I can't interfere." Her protests were cut short, however, when Lori grabbed her arm. "Please, Celia, stay and eat with us." Looking at her new friend, Celia smiled and said, "Okay, Lori, just for you." Looking at Frank, she smiled again. "Thank you. I would love to have dinner with your family." The four of them sat down at the table, and Celia was the subject of many questions from the two children about her experiences in law enforcement. Frank ate and listened, simultaneously amused by his children's curiosity and amazed at how easily Celia handled their questions. He suddenly realized that for the first time in a long time, the two of them seemed to be coming out of their mournful shell. When dessert was finished, Frank sent Bobby and Lori off to do chores, and then offered Celia a cup of coffee. As they sat at the table, Frank had a chance to ask his questions. "You seem to be comfortable with Bobby and Lori. Do you work with young people often?" She smiled. "I actually come from a big family, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the oldest, so I guess I was a second mom to the others." She paused to take a sip of coffee, then continued. "That's why I knew what to do with Lori this afternoon. I've walked each of my sisters through the trauma of puberty." She looked at Frank and smiled again. "For that matter, my father was as helpless as you are now." Frank grinned mischievously. "Well, all I can say is that I'm glad you ended up here. Even when I finally realized what was going on, I still wouldn't have known how to calm Lori down so quickly." She smiled in appreciation, but then her expression turned more serious. "How are they coping with the loss of their mother?" she asked. Frank sighed. "As well as could be expected, I suppose. Lori was very clingy. I think she's sorely lacking in female influence. As for Bobby, it's hard to say. He's gotten moody and a bit withdrawn, but I don't know if that has to do with Mary's death or just the fact that he's a teenager now." Celia looked at him sympathetically. From what I've seen, I think you're doing a great job with them. It's just going to take time, both for them and for you. With those words, she stood up and said, I really enjoyed the meal, Frank, but I've been intruding on your family for too long. I have to go now, but if you don't mind, I'd like to say goodbye to Lori and Bobby. When Frank nodded, she walked out into the hallway and Frank heard her say goodbye to Bobby. She then spent a few minutes in Lori's room, and when she returned, Lori was walking beside her with her arm around Celia's waist. She really has a new friend, Frank thought in surprise. A few days later, a package arrived in the mail for Lori. When his excited daughter opened the package, she found a pink stuffed elephant and a note from Celia. Frank rejoiced at this concern, but was puzzled by the choice. Lori's too old for stuffed animals, he thought, but was surprised to see that the toy had taken a prominent place on Lori's bed. I guess there's still a little girl living in it, he admitted. The next day, he called Celia's office to thank her. I never would have thought of it, he admitted, but somehow it was just what was needed for Lori. Celia was pleased that her daughter was pleased with her gift and made Frank promise to keep in touch and let her know how Lori and Bobby were doing. A few weeks later, Frank was paying his bills when he received a call from Bobby's teacher one morning. I'd like to meet with you to talk about your son, the teacher told Frank. He's having discipline problems at school. Frank agreed to meet with her the next day, but decided not to say anything to Bobby that evening. He wanted to wait until he knew what was wrong and only then talk to his son. The meeting was scheduled for the next day after school while the kids were in PE. Mrs. Soldana, the home grade teacher, told the concerned father that Bobby's behavior in class had gotten worse over the past few months. At first, I didn't want to say anything because I know he's been through a lot, the teacher explained, but it seems to be getting worse. He's getting more and more distracted, not doing his homework, and the other teachers tell me he's not paying attention in their classes. He's always done well in his classes so far, but his grades are going to drop a lot this semester if he doesn't do anything to change the situation. Frank was concerned. Do you think, Mrs. Soldana, how much of this is affected by adolescence? No doubt it's a difficult age for children, especially boys, she told him, but we're used to it. I think his mother's death is affecting him more than he can tell you. Perhaps you should see a psychologist. Frank thanked the woman and went back to the car to wait impatiently for the kids to finish their gym class. He was upset to hear about Bobby's problems and was determined to have a long talk with the boy. When Frank brought Bobby and Lori home, he sent Lori to her room to start her homework and then led Bobby into the master bedroom. The boy's face darkened. He realized he was in trouble. Frank recounted his visit to Bobby's homeroom teacher and gave some examples she had given him. What's going on, Bobby? Why are you acting like this? Frank demanded. No reason, replied the boy sullenly. Come on, you're smarter than that. His father brushed him off. Don't you care about your grades? Not really, Bobby muttered. Frank was annoyed at his son's unresponsiveness and in anger tried to shame him. What will your mother think if she finds out you failed everything? Who cares? Shouted Bobby back angrily. She was such a slut! Shocked and angry, Frank grabbed his son and yelled at him. Don't you ever talk about your mother like that. How can you say that? Frightened by his father's rage and the pain of his tight grip, the boy whispered, I saw her doing it with that man. As soon as the words were off his lips, he collapsed on the bed and sobbed. Frank sat down on the bed beside his son in amazement, put his arms around him and cradled him like a small child. It's all right, he repeated, trying to soothe the boy's obvious distress. When Bobby's crying subsided, Frank lifted his son's head. It's all right, Bobby. I'm not mad at you. Just tell me what you saw. His son looked up at him with tears in his eyes. It was last fall. You let me ride my bike to school one day, but I forgot my math homework, so I snuck home during lunch and took it. While I was looking for it in my room, I heard my mom come in. I didn't want her to catch me, so I hid. That's when I heard a man's voice. What man? Frank asked, a little hurriedly. I don't know, answered Bobby. Some guy. I've never seen him before. That's all right, Frank reassured him. Just tell me what happened next. They came in here, and then it got quiet, and I thought I could sneak out. But then I heard my mom make a funny sound and I got scared and I looked into the room and they were lying on the bed. The words came out of his mouth faster and faster, like he was desperately trying to spit them out, and when he was done, he burst into tears again. Why did she do that, Daddy? How could Mom act like such a slut? Listening to his son's story, Frank felt himself going numb. But he didn't have time to deal with his own emotions. His son needed him. I understand, Bobby. It's all right. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm glad you told me. He gently took his son by the shoulders and turned him around to face him. Sometimes the people we love make mistakes or do things we don't like. It doesn't mean we don't love them anymore, just that we don't like what they did. I don't know why your mother did what she did, son, but I do know that she loved you and Lori very much. I want you to remember only good things about her. He hugged his son and continued to talk to him for a while longer. When he felt the boy had calmed down enough, he gently asked him to get on with his homework, and Frank went to the kitchen to make dinner. Before Bobby left, Frank asked him not to say anything to Lori. The boy promised, and Frank was sure he would keep the disturbing news from his sister. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but as soon as the children went to bed, Frank began to vent his emotions. His first reaction was to deny what Bobby had told him. His son must have been mistaken or misinterpreted what he had seen. But he couldn't stick to that logic for long. His son was too upset about what had happened. After this confession, Frank's thoughts turned bitter. How could Mary betray him? He thought they had a solid marriage, so how could she have been having fun with someone on the side? And anyway, who was this person and how long had their affair lasted? It's hard to lose your wife in a plane crash, he thought in despair. It's even worse to find out you lost her long before that. Sleep didn't come that night, and the next day Frank was in a black mood. It was Tuesday, the day he usually went to the gym, and after the kids left for school, he decided to continue his exercises. For a while, the exercise helped distract him, but when he sat down on the treadmill, his thoughts returned to his wife's infidelity. How could Mary do that? And even in our own bed, he asked. Somehow that scene made the betrayal all the more horrible. And how could she know I wouldn't be home? But the answer followed immediately. It must have been one of those days when I went to the gym. I'm such a habitual person that she was sure the house would be empty. But the answer to that question immediately spawned others. If she planned her little encounter to fit my schedule, that doesn't mean it happened out of the blue. How often did she meet with him? She couldn't have met him every week. Her travel schedule might have interfered. Each question seemed to beget another, and each one only added to his misery. He tried his best to act normal around Bobby and Lori, but over the next few days he continued to suffer. He decided to go to the pharmacy and buy antacids. He had never had stomach problems before. His suffering was compounded by the fact that he had no one to talk to about his discovery. He certainly didn't want to tell his parents or Meredith. He knew the news would be devastating to them. Likewise, he didn't want to talk to his friends, risking becoming the subject of neighborhood gossip. Also, he thought, I don't want to risk any of my classmates teasing Bobby or Lori. He felt trapped. He was working at his desk one evening when he noticed Celia Murray's business card. She told me to call her if I had any more information, he remembered. But in truth, he was desperately looking for any excuse to share his news with someone and get another point of view. He called the cell phone number she'd written on the card, and when he introduced himself, Celia seemed pleased to hear from him. But her tone changed to concerned when he said he needed to talk to her. Are Lori and Bobby all right? She asked anxiously. With them, yes, but not with me, he replied. Would you mind having lunch with me tomorrow? It's not something I want to discuss over the phone. She quickly agreed and suggested a place near the GBI office where she worked. It's a quiet place, we can talk, she assured him. Hanging up the phone, Frank felt somewhat relieved at the prospect of talking. Celia was waiting in the restaurant when Frank appeared in the doorway. She smiled in greeting, but the smile quickly disappeared when she saw the frustrated expression on his face. After they sat down at the table and ordered, she couldn't take it anymore. For heaven's sake, Frank, what's wrong? You asked me to let you know if I had any more information about my wife, he said. I don't know if it has anything to do with your investigation, but I just found out that Meredith is cheating on me. As he said it, he felt ashamed, tears flooding his eyes and running down his cheeks. Celia reached across the table and took his hands in hers. Oh, Frank, this is terrible. Tell me what happened. The whole story of the meeting with Bobby's teacher, the confrontation with his son, and Bobby's painful revelation poured forth in a river, interrupted only by the appearance of food. Celia listened in silence, letting him narrate at his own pace. Only when he reached the end did she speak. Poor Bobby, she said. No wonder he behaves like that at school. It must have been festering him ever since it all happened. And then her death, no wonder he's so worried. She had let go of Frank's hands when the waitress brought their order, but now leaned across the table to reach for him again. "It's hard for me to imagine what this has done to you, Frank," she said quietly, and Frank saw the sympathy in her eyes. "Were there any signs that something was wrong, Frank? Now that you look back, did you notice any clues?" she asked. "No," he replied. "I can't say I noticed anything. You know what they say, the husband is always the last to know." He lowered his gaze to his untouched plate for a moment, then looked at the woman again. "Ever since she got her big promotion, our sex life has gone downhill dramatically. But because of the pressures of her new role and travel schedule, I figured it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt I had to put up with it for the sake of our family. She kept telling me that things would get better when she moved to the national level, but—" He paused. "That didn't seem destined to happen." Then he frowned. "What kills me is that I don't have any answers. I don't know what bastard she slept with. I don't know when their affair started or how long it lasted. I don't know if she was in love with the guy or if she was planning to leave me. Worst of all, I don't know why she did this to me and the kids." Celia squeezed his hands. "Frank, please listen to me. The truth is, you're not likely to ever get answers to your questions. You're going to have to forget about all of this. When she dies, none of it will matter anymore. All you can do is focus on taking care of your family and yourself." "I know you're right," he said, "but it hurts so much to be betrayed like that, I think, when she stopped loving me." "No," Celia said firmly, "you're wrong. Whatever happened, it's obvious that Meredith still cared deeply for you and the children. Look at what you learned at MMK. She bought maximum life insurance to make sure you were all protected. She maxed out her contributions to the 401k plan to put money aside for your future. I don't know what else has happened in her life, but it all looks like care to me." "Oh, thank you, Celia. I'll try to remember that." As they got up to leave, he looked at the table. Neither of them had touched their food. "Looks like I'm not the best choice for lunch," he remarked wryly. "Don't worry about it," she replied lightly. "Skipping a meal or two is probably good for me." Frank cast a glance over her slender figure. "She looks pretty good to me," he thought. "It's been a long time," he said to himself regretfully. As they were walking out the door, she took his hand. "Please stay in touch, Frank, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I'd really like to help." Then she reached up and kissed his cheek. As she turned away, Frank thought a blush appeared on her cheeks. Back home, Frank was surprised to find that his mood had changed. "I guess I really needed to talk it out," he said to himself. The following Saturday, Frank was out in the yard picking up limbs that had fallen during a thunderstorm. When he entered the house, he saw Lori talking on the phone. He turned to Bobby, who was standing nearby. "Did someone call?" Frank asked. "No," replied Bobby dismissively. "She's just talking to her new best friend Celia." Frank wondered. "She calls Celia a lot? What's a best friend?" "Oh, Dad," Bobby replied in despair. "You're totally out of line. BFF is best friend forever." At that moment, Lori looked up and saw her father. "Dad, can we take Celia out to dinner?" "Let me talk to her," he said, holding out his hand to his daughter. When she handed him the phone, he said, "Hi, Celia. I think you heard. Would you like to have dinner with Lori tonight? Bobby and I will be here too." He heard her melodious laugh, followed by a quick agreement. "Very well," he said. "Why don't you come here about 6 o'clock?" After they had agreed, Frank hung up the phone and turned to his daughter. "Well, here she is," he said. "I hope you'll be happy." "Oh, yes, Daddy," she squeaked. "In that case, you and Bobby should clean up the place so she doesn't think we're living like pigs." "Oh, Daddy, do I have to do that?" Bobby protested. But before Frank could answer, the boy turned and began to gather up the clothes left in the room. "He's still a teenager," thought Frank. "But he seems to be getting better." Turning around and heading into the kitchen, Frank began to ponder what kind of dish he should make. Definitely something better than spaghetti and meatballs, he thought, remembering the first time Celia had dinner with them. He finally settled on the fish dish, which he considered one of his specialties. He was sure he could make it, and the kids liked it, which was always a plus. For that, he knew he would have to make a trip to the grocery store. After explaining his errand to Bobby and Lori, he told them to stay in the house until he returned. He found a nice piece of salmon in the seafood department and then decided to buy dessert at the bakery. I should grab a bottle of good wine, he thought, and steered the cart to the appropriate aisle. Once he found what he wanted, he stopped by the floral section of the store and bought a bouquet for the table. On the way home, he thought about what he was doing. I'm really getting full on this food, he realized with amazement. He finally decided it was because he owed Celia a good lunch. After all, I did ruin her lunch, he said to himself. Celia rang the doorbell at 6 o'clock, and no sooner had Frank gotten to the door than Lori was already ushering her in. To Frank's surprise, even Bobby deigned to show up, and the teenager made polite conversation. Frank, for his part, was feeling a little awkward and inarticulate, but if Celia noticed it, she didn't show it in any way. Instead, she chatted cheerfully with Lori and willingly went with her to see what the girl wanted to show Celia in her room. By the time they reappeared, dinner was almost ready. The supper was as good as it could be. Celia was duly impressed with his culinary abilities. "Oh, a man who can cook? My mom warned me about the likes of you," she teased, as well as the fact that he was clearly at ease with the children, who chattered away, answering her questions. When dessert was finished, she insisted on joining in the cleanup, and with her help, the dishes were soon put away, rinsed, and put in the dishwasher to run later. At this point, Bobby excused himself to continue a video game he had paused, and Lori wanted to watch a favorite program she had videotaped, so the two adults filled their glasses with wine and went out into the living room. "Frank, that was wonderful," Celia complimented him. "I don't know when I've had such a good time. Thank you so much for inviting me." "I don't think Lori will ever talk to me again if I don't," Frank laughed, and Celia joined him. "She's a wonderful girl, and you're lucky to have her," she replied. "And her father is doing a pretty good job, too." Frank felt his face redden, but then Celia's face took on a more serious expression. "Frank, besides having a great time with you, I'm glad you invited me because I have some information I want to share with you." Frank caught the new intonation in her voice and looked at her curiously. "It's very confidential, Frank, but I think I know you well enough to trust you, and it concerns you, at least indirectly." Now she certainly had his attention. "As you know," Celia began, "the GBI had to conduct a routine investigation before issuing your wife's death certificate, and as you also know, we found nothing that would give us grounds to refuse to issue a certificate that was properly issued." She took a deep breath and continued. "Naturally, we did the same thing with John Collier, but found a few oddities. For one thing, it turned out that he was in financial trouble after a series of bad investment decisions." Frank nodded. Celia's words matched what Amanda Collier had told him. "In addition, over the past few weeks," Celia continued, "IMC Security has informed us that they have discovered what appears to be significant irregularities in Southeastern University's accounting department, headed by John Collier. More disturbingly, they believe they have uncovered a fraudulent billing scheme that may have resulted in the theft of millions of dollars from IMC, and John Collier appears to have authorized it." "Poor Amanda," Frank commented. "She didn't deserve that." But then he began to consider what Celia had told him, and new possibilities opened up before him. "Could John Collier have had a hand in the disaster?" he asked. "Could it have been a way of covering his tracks?" When Celia answered nothing, Frank's imagination kicked into overdrive. What if Meredith found out about Collier's plan? What if he killed her to silence her and used the plane crash to hide the evidence? Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he's hiding out in some villa by the sea and laughing at all of us. "Take your time, Frank," Celia urged. "You're getting carried away. The most likely scenario remains that the plane went down unexpectedly, as we've assumed all along. If Collier was indeed involved in the theft scheme, the crash disrupted his plans. We'll explore all possibilities, but we can't jump to conclusions, and neither should you." But Frank was having trouble shutting off his imagination. "You don't think Meredith could have had anything to do with this, do you?" he asked sharply. Celia sighed. "It's not out of the question," she agreed, "but we don't think it's likely. For one thing, if she was involved, it would mean that she planned ahead of time to abandon her family. It's unusual for a mother to abandon her children, especially children their age," she said, gesturing to the children's rooms. Collier, on the other hand, had no children, and his wife reported that their marriage was on the verge of falling apart at the time of his disappearance. Moreover, unlike Collier, Meredith's finances were in perfect order, and prior to her disappearance, she had done nothing to suggest that she was involved in any plan, if there was one, of course. In fact, her actions were the exact opposite of those of someone planning to disappear. But that is mere speculation. The only fact we have, Celia continued, is that Meredith's plane did indeed crash into the sea. She had hoped to reassure Frank, But when she looked at him, she realized that he was still upset by her revelations. Frank, you have to promise me that you won't say anything about this. It's very confidential, and if it gets out, it could jeopardize our investigation. It could also get me fired. This made Frank tense. He realized that Celia had taken a risk by confiding in him, and he was obliged to keep quiet. I understand, Celia, and I promise I won't jeopardize your investigation. But I have to ask, why did you tell me all this? She looked at him gravely. It's unlikely, Frank, but there's always the possibility that you'll hear or learn something that will help us shed some light on all this. If you do, Frank, promise me you'll get back to me right away. No Lone Rangers, please. He returned her gaze. I promise, Celia. Then he smiled. Besides, if I have to mess around with you again, it won't be that hard. The smile she gave him seemed to light up the entire room. Soon afterward, Celia had to leave. Before doing so, she said goodbye to Bobby and Lori. Frank noted that Bobby interrupted his game to say goodnight to her, which was a real compliment on his part. Lori walked her friend to the door again, snatching Celia's promise to call her. But this time, after Lori hugged her, Celia didn't fail to lean against the door and kiss Frank on the cheek. As she walked to her car, Lori looked at her dad and said, "She likes you, Dad." Frank smiled at his daughter and pulled her to him. Well, I like her too. When everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Frank lay in his bed thinking about what Celia had told him and the different scenarios he had envisioned. Oh, Mary, he thought, what have you gotten yourself into? Finally, he fell into a restless sleep. A week later, Frank was sitting at his computer and noticed something unusual. He was reading about some of his favorite sports teams, and as he was about to click on the Falcons tab, he noticed a Facebook icon right above it. On a whim, he clicked on it. Frank wasn't a Facebook follower. In fact, he rarely logged onto the site at all. The only reason he had an account was so he could keep track of his children. Bobby and Lori loved the social networking site and used it as another way to keep in touch with their friends. Frank didn't mind at first, but after reading a couple scary articles about some of the pitfalls, he started his own account and insisted that Bobby and Lori add him as a friend. He also asked them to give him the passwords to their pages. That way, he reasoned, I would be able to see all the messages and pictures they posted, as well as anything their friends sent them. More importantly, he thought, Bobby and Lori would know that he could spy on them, and that, he hoped, would encourage them to be discreet. When he logged onto his page, most of what he saw didn't interest him. But he did notice a friend request from someone he'd never heard of, Tom Thomason. The name seemed unfamiliar to him, and there was no photo, just a silhouette. When Frank clicked on the name, the stranger's page blandly informed him that personal information was only available to friends. Hey, Bobby, he called out. Do we know any Tom Thomason? His son walked into the room and saw his father browsing Facebook. Oh, that guy. Just ignore him, Dad. He's been talking me into adding him as a friend for weeks now. I just delete his requests. At that moment, Lori peeked into the room. Yeah, he's been trying to talk me into adding him as a friend too. He's just some jerk on Facebook. That was enough to get Frank's attention. Some unknown person wanted to contact not only him, but his kids as well. Frank knew that there were both scammers and much scarier predators in the world. He was alarmed, but he didn't want to scare the kids, so he only said, You two did exactly the right thing, he assured them. Never respond online to someone you don't know well. As he searched for a way to protect his family, a sudden thought occurred to him. Maybe Celia can help us find out who this creep Thomason is. He called her home, and she must have seen his name in the caller ID because she answered warmly, Hi, Frank. Hi, Celia. I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a chance to come over? Something strange has come up, and I'd like to find out with you if you're free. It's nothing serious, is it? Bobby and Lori are fine, aren't they? As he comforted her, Frank couldn't help but notice that she seemed as concerned about his children as he was himself. It gave him a warm feeling. She told him she was working in the yard, but would be able to drive up in 45 minutes. To Frank's surprise, almost that minute her car pulled up to the curb. With Mary, he remembered, he'd been lucky if she was no more than an hour late, trying to create the perfect image. But Celia had arrived right on time, clearly freshly washed, dressed in a casual but attractive outfit, with her hair neatly styled and fresh makeup. It was obvious she had made an effort, even in such a short time. You look good, Celia. You didn't need to dress up for us, he told her. She squeezed his hand. Thank you, Frank. I've been looking forward to this. As soon as she was inside the house, Frank called out to his children. As they noisily entered the room, he asked them to tell Celia about their potential Facebook friend. Bobby, as the official expert in the family, took the opportunity to brag. He quickly logged into each of the family's 3 Facebook accounts in turn and received a friend request from the mysterious Tom Thomason. Praising Bobby's skill, Celia sat down in front of the screen and called up all the unread and archived messages, but found no additional information. Finally, she looked up at Bobby and Lori. The most likely answer is some kind of marketing ploy. If you accepted the request, you'd probably get all sorts of ads selling junk you don't need or offers to buy imaginary gold from Nigeria. There are bad people in the world, and you should never let strangers know about you, okay? Both kids nodded solemnly, and Frank thought to himself that the message he'd heard from Celia had probably had a stronger effect on them than when he'd delivered it. As they worked on the computer, it got dark outside, and Frank realized that his kids were about to get hungry. Celia, we'll probably go out to dinner soon. It won't be anything fancy, just a family restaurant, but we'd love for you to join us if you can. As Frank had anticipated, Lori and even Bobby immediately began demanding that she go with them. She laughingly submitted to the inevitable. The 4 of them loaded into Frank's sedan and drove to a random place not far from their house. As they drove, Celia began asking the kids about what she'd seen on their Facebook pages, and soon Lori and Bobby were eagerly talking about their friends and activities. Listening to the conversation, Frank thought, Celia probably already knows more about what's going on in Lori and Bobby's lives than Mary does. He remembered that on the rare occasions they had met together before her death, Meredith's conversations had mostly revolved around her work. He felt guilty about his infidelity, but knew it was true. The lively conversation continued during dinner and the drive home, and Frank was glad when Celia walked into the house with them. The kids immediately sat down in front of the TV and asked Celia to watch with them, but she waved them off. I need to talk to your daddy for a while. She took his hand and led him into the living room. When they sat down, her face grew serious and she said, I didn't want to alarm Bobby and Lori, but I don't think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. There have been reports of identity theft scams reported to the Bureau, but they're not usually aimed at children. To me, it sounds like someone is specifically trying to get your family's information. The thought of his children being in danger sent a chill through Frank. Who could it be? What could they possibly want? I don't know, Frank, she replied. This is unlike any cyber fraud scheme I've encountered before. What can we do? Shut down their Facebook accounts? Maybe keep them off the net altogether? She looked thoughtful. I don't think that's necessary, provided they're careful and don't socialize with strangers. And if they get nonsense emails with embedded websites, warn them never to click on the links. She thought for another moment, then said, The problem with the internet is that it's so amorphous. You can't tell who you're dealing with or where they are, but it's not as opaque as many people think. I have a friend in the federal government who can help us. He may not be able to find out who Tom Thomason is, but he can tell us where he lives. Let me call on Monday and let you know what I find out. With these words, she got up and went to her room to say goodnight to the 2 children. When she returned, Frank accompanied her to the door, but before she opened it, he embraced her. You've been like a guardian angel to us, he said sincerely. I don't know what we would have done without you. She looked into his eyes for a moment and then kissed him quickly on the lips. I don't know if I want to be an angel, she said with a wink. They don't have much fun. Then she turned and strode briskly to her car, leaving Frank standing bewildered. True to her word, Celia called Frank late Monday morning. Do you know anyone in Palm Beach, Florida? She asked. Not a soul, Frank replied. Whoever Tom Thomason is, he created his Facebook account with a zip code starting with 334, so he's somewhere in Palm Beach County, she said. I can't imagine why anyone in Palm Beach would try to contact us, Frank said. But at least he's not in the neighborhood. That's reassuring. I agree, Celia said. Besides, we're tracking a lot of scams in South Florida, so maybe this really is some new kind of internet fraud. Just make sure Bobby and Lori have nothing to do with these friend requests. I will, Celia, and thank you. I feel so much better about the whole thing. I'm so glad I could help, Frank. Despite what he said to Celia, Frank was not in the least relieved. On the contrary, it seemed to him that he and his children were under continuous attack. First came the terrible news of Meredith's death. Then poor Bobby confessed that his wife had cheated on him. Then he got word that Mary might have been involved in some fraudulent business dealings before her death, and now some unknown person was trying to get information about his children. Frank felt like they were under siege, so he decided to fight back. His first priority was to find the enemy in Palm Beach County and confront him. But how could he do that? A cursory internet search showed that the county had a population of 1.3 million. Looking for Tom Thomason would be like looking for a short stick in tall grass. Besides, Frank thought, it was just as likely that the name could be a fake. Relieved, Frank continued to beat on the problem. Then an idea struck him. If I can't find Thomason, maybe I can get him to find me. A plan began to form in his mind. The chances are slim, he admitted, but it's all I've got. The first thing he needed to do was to get Bobby and Lori out of the way. It was almost time for summer vacation, and that gave Frank an idea. He dialed a relative's number. Dad, would you and Mom like Bobby and Lori to come visit us for a week? I'll need to be out of town for that time, so you'd be a big help to us. When the children's grandfather happily agreed and all the issues surrounding their stay were resolved, Frank hung up the phone and immediately called Delta. I'd like to book a flight to Palm Beach. His children were thrilled with the news of their upcoming visit to their grandparents, but their enthusiasm faded when they learned that their father would not be traveling with them. It would be the first separation since their mother's death, and the prospect brought back the fear of abandonment they had felt since then. Frank hated to cause the children distress, but he felt he had to do what he had in mind, and he succeeded in convincing them. A week before the visit began, Frank began to be plagued by doubts. Am I doing the right thing? He asked himself. But despite the uncertainty, the thought of doing nothing was worse. His inner turmoil was briefly interrupted by a phone call from Celia, who called to inquire how he and his family were doing. After a few minutes of conversation, the tone of her voice changed slightly, and Frank thought she sounded almost shy. I was wondering if you wanted to get together next week. I haven't seen you and the kids in a while, and her voice trailed off uncertainly. I'd love to, Celia, but then I'm taking the kids to their grandparents. We'll be gone all week. Oh, she said. I understand. Maybe some other time sometime. I'd like that very much, Celia, he said fervently. Frank felt bad about lying to Celia about his plans, but he said to himself, at least it was partly true. Besides, he was sure he knew what she would say if he revealed his true plans. When Frank returned home and took the children to his relatives in the country, he immediately sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons he asked Meredith's family to take the children was that he knew they didn't have a computer. So he felt safe logging onto Lori's Facebook. Sure enough, a request to be added as a friend from Tom Thomason popped up. Frank clicked accept and quickly got confirmation that Lori was now friends with this stranger. If nothing comes of this, Frank thought, I'll just unsubscribe from him later. Next came the hardest part, pretending to be a 12-year-old girl. He studied his daughter's previous messages and decided he could imitate her style pretty well. I may not be able to fool her friends, he admitted to himself, but I hope I can fool Tom Thomason. He decided that his first message should lay the foundation and wrote a short note about his visit to the country. Lori? Just a little news to her friends, thought Frank. Nothing to arouse the suspicions of the lurkers. The next day he planned to set a trap. OMG, I'm going to Florida. My best friend Celia offered to take me with her and my dad agreed. Flying out tomorrow? Can't wait. Frank decided to call Celia by her first name because he didn't think either Lori's friends or Tom Thomason knew her. He hoped Celia wouldn't mind. Now that the bait was in the water, Frank hoped he could jiggle it enough to get the fish's attention. I can't believe I'm in Palm Beach. That's to die for. In the evening, Frank posted the following note. Spent the day at the beach? I'm going to be so tan. The next morning, Frank posted a note that he hoped would not go unnoticed. I'm going to the beach again tonight. Tomorrow, Celia is taking me shopping on Worth Avenue. Lunch at Taboo's. 2 glasses of Kool-Aid. As soon as the entry appeared on Lori's page, Frank headed for Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon, he was already settled into his seat for the 2-hour flight to Palm Beach. Looking out the window, he remembered that he had been to Palm Beach once before. He and Mary had driven through the city on their way back from their honeymoon in Miami Beach. They drove over the Lake Worth Bridge and then traveled along Southern Ocean Boulevard, admiring the mansions overlooking the Atlantic. Once they landed, Frank rented a car and drove to a motel in West Palm Beach where he had a room reserved. There was a fast food restaurant across the street, and he grabbed a sandwich and a Coke, which he ate in the room while studying a map of the city on his laptop. He hoped he was doing the right thing. After breakfast, he checked Lori's Facebook page, but found only a few envious replies from her classmates. He didn't expect Thomason to contact him, but he hoped his fishing expedition would turn up something. Around 10 in the morning, he got in his car and drove east over the Royal Park Bridge, turned south, and then east again to Worth Avenue. He wanted to arrive early and park the car on the street so he could get there quickly if needed. After driving a few times around the block where the restaurant was located, he was beginning to wonder if he had miscalculated, but suddenly a car pulled out in front of him and he was able to park. Putting down the meter, he walked down the street toward the restaurant. Spotting a bench in the shade, he gratefully sat down on it. He grabbed a baseball cap and sunglasses and put them on, hoping to disguise himself. Then he pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post newspaper and pretended to read while looking around the street. As he sat there, the realization came to him of how flimsy his plan was. He had no idea if the mysterious Tom Thomason had seen the fake posts on Lori's Facebook page and would show up in response. Worse, Frank had no idea who he was looking for. Unless the mystery man turned out to be John Collier, which Frank thought unlikely, how would he be able to recognize the threat? All he could hope for was to spot the suspicious man, whatever that meant, and come face to face with him. The street was crowded, and Frank tried his best to keep an eye out for any passers-by. The restaurant was starting to fill up, and his stomach rumbled as he watched the entrance. He cursed himself for not thinking to bring a sandwich with him, but he hesitated to leave his post. Time stretched slowly as he sat there, and after a while he noticed that the crowd in the restaurant was beginning to thin. Glancing at his watch, he realized that over an hour had passed. What an idiot, he thought. I won't feel any worse if I stay home, and at least I'll be able to see Celia again. While he was looking at the shoppers passing by, his attention was caught by a woman strolling across the street. Here we go again, thought Frank. I'll see Mary in a crowd of strangers. In fact, he noted, the woman looked nothing like Meredith. Meredith had shoulder-length brunette hair, while this woman was a blonde with a short haircut, and her clothes were different from anything Frank had ever seen Meredith wear. But there was something eerily familiar about her, and as he continued to watch her, Frank realized that it was her gait that had triggered his reaction. Impulsively, he got up and followed her. Throwing a glance outside, he saw that the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to hail a cab. Risking his life, Frank ran across Worth Avenue and jumped into the car. Just as he pulled away from the curb, he saw the woman climb into the back seat of the cab and race down the avenue toward the Atlantic. Before reaching Southern Ocean Boulevard, the cab turned left onto County Road and headed north. Frank followed it for some distance. Finally, he saw the cab turn left onto a suburban street and kept going until it got almost to Lake Worth. Frank stopped the car at the curb a football field away and watched as the woman paid the driver and then entered the elegant house that overlooked the lake. Frank squinted his eyes, trying to get a better look at her. With her hair color and short haircut, she looked nothing like Mary. But she was the same height and weight, and as she walked down the path to the house, Frank was again amazed at her gait. Sitting in the car, Frank suddenly remembered a book he had read a long time ago. In the story, an actor needed a disguise, but instead of a false mustache or wig, he simply put pebbles in his shoes. If someone sees me, the actor told his friend, they'll say, "It looks like that guy, but it's not him, because I'll walk differently." It works the other way too, Frank thought. As he thought back to the book, the certainty grew in him that he had just seen his deceased wife. Trying to hold back his growing anger, he ran down the street and walked to the door. Ringing the doorbell, he crossed his arms and waited. When the door opened, the woman looked at him with a perplexed look. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Hi, Mary. Funny to meet you here," he said sarcastically. After a second's hesitation, she reached out her arms to hug him, but he quickly raised his hands to stop her. "Don't touch me," he growled. Then, unable to contain his anger any longer, he shouted, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave Bobby and Lori?" Throwing a concerned look outside, Meredith grabbed his arm and dragged him into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I did all this for you, baby, for you and the kids," she urged him. "You have to believe me. It was the only way out." As she spoke, glancing around nervously every now and then. "What the hell are you talking about?" Frank demanded hotly. "You're missing the point. None of this makes any sense." "Sit down, kid," she coaxed him. You have to let me explain everything. She was still talking loudly and rubbing her hands together nervously as she sat down and urged him to continue. When Frank sat down, an icy calm came over him. Okay, Mary, I'm listening. I was so close to it, baby. I had a coveted big job in my pocket, but then the damn economy went down the drain. I knew that if I could get a little more publicity in the region, the economy would rebound and the promotion would be secured. She smiled pleadingly and held out her palms to her husband. And Frank, once I get this job, we'll be on Easy Street. No worries about paying for college for the kids, no worries about retirement, no worries ever again. Frank could barely contain himself. Was it really all about money and Mary's position in the company? Meredith's hands rested on her lap again. So John and I... John Collier, Frank said grimly. Yes, she continued, not catching his mood. You've met him. Anyway, he and I figured out a way to move a few sales from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd show up eventually, we just ordered them earlier in the current quarter. Every other region was reporting a significant drop in sales, and we had a significant increase. Corporate was just thrilled. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid, she says proudly. Then the smile slides off her face like a rag thrown on the floor. But the economy was getting worse, not better, and when John told me that eventually it would all come out, I knew we had to do something about it. We knew we'd need a lot of money to pull this thing off, so John created a dummy vendor account and started sending fake invoices to IMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful over there, they didn't even notice. So you plan to fake your death in a plane crash to cover your tracks? Frank asked. That's right, kid, she said, as if Frank was her star pupil. With enough money, it's not hard to get someone to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal in the Caribbean. We just homed in on the signal and landed right next to it. So the whole thing was just a way to steal a lot of money and leave your family behind? John asked bitterly. No, baby, she protested. It wasn't like that at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids were okay. I took out life insurance and put everything I could into my 401k so you guys would have enough money, she said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for losing your wife and the mother of our children? This time she heard his bitterness. No, baby, no. You don't understand. I was going to come back for you. As soon as things settled down, I was going to contact you. We could go somewhere safe, baby. We could be together. As she spoke, her eyes continued to dart around the room. Frank looked at her with a stony expression. You're only missing one thing, he said in an even voice. Which is what exactly, kid? She asked. You forgot how much fun you had with John Collier, he said. She was surprised at first, but then stood up and held out her arms to him. No, baby, it wasn't like that. John and I just worked together. We were never more than co-workers. Don't lie to me, Meredith, Frank snapped back. Bobby saw you two together in our bedroom. She sighed. God, did Bobby really see us? Oh, that's awful. A sob caught in her throat, but then she came to her senses and straightened up again. It was just one time, baby. He said he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him, but it was just one time, I swear. Frank stood up. Ignoring her, he looked around. Come out, John, he said loudly. I know you're in here somewhere. Meredith continued to pant. No, baby, it's just me. It was just one time. But before she could finish the sentence, John Collier appeared from the bedroom. He was dressed in a robe and had his hands in his pockets. Lay off, Mary, he knows, Collier muttered. Although he guessed they lived together, the fact that Collier said his wife's favorite name made Frank wince. Meredith began to cry. He must have found us through Facebook, Collier grumbled. I warned you, but you just had to check on your two offspring. Then his tone changed to cold and hard. But that doesn't matter now. We need to get out of here. He turned to Frank and pulled an automatic rifle from his robe pocket, which he pointed at Frank. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, John, no, Meredith shouted, but Collier ignored her. Looks like your kids are going to lose not only their daddy, but their mommy as well, he said with a chuckle, raising his gun at Frank. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the hallway. All three turned around in astonishment to see that Celia Murray had appeared in front of them, holding a Smith & Wesson automatic to Collier's throat. Before Collier could react, a second voice came from behind him. Drop the gun, Collier, it's over. Special Agent Harold Barnes emerged from the kitchen, his gun also pointed at Collier. The former head of the accounting department looked hostilely at the two agents, but then his shoulders slumped. He dropped the gun to the carpet and slowly raised his hands. While Barnes held the gun at gunpoint, Celia quickly stepped behind the sullen man and twisted one of his arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs around his wrist. She then reached down with her other hand and snapped the second handcuff. Securing Collier, she repeated the procedure with Meredith. While they lay on the floor, Barnes made a cell phone call to the Palm Beach Police Department. A second call went to the local FBI office. A short time later, uniformed and plainclothes police officers gathered at the house. Frank just stood by, stunned, watching the scene. As the fugitives were led away, Frank scrutinized them both. Collier was muttering something to himself. Meredith was crying. Neither of them looked in Frank's direction. When they left, Celia walked over to Barnes, put her arms around him and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for coming with me, partner. I owe you a great debt of gratitude." The senior agent smiled. "No, you owe me nothing. The resolution of this case will reflect very well on our personal affairs." As Barnes was leaving, Celia finally looked at Frank. To his amazement, she walked over to him, put her arms around his neck and sobbed. "You big idiot, don't you ever do that to me again. You might get yourself killed." He held her tightly until her sobs subsided. Then he pulled her away from him enough that he could look into her face. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "How did you know where to find me?" She smiled through her tears. "Lori called me to chat. When she said you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I suspected you were about to do something stupid and started making inquiries. After seeing her Facebook posts, I called the airline and found out that you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Harold into coming with me, and we've been tracking you since this morning." She shook her head. "We almost lost you when you took off after that cab, but Harold guessed which way you turned and was right." Frank pulled her even tighter against him. "I guess you really are my guardian angel," he said, and kissed her. 2 years later, Frank pulled the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. The humidity was high as always, and the wind off Puget Sound was cold and damp. And yet, thought Frank, it feels good to be here. The last 2 years had been difficult in many ways. If it was a terrible shock to Frank to learn that his wife was alive, for Bobby and Lori the consequences were even worse. The fact that she went to trial and was convicted of numerous criminal charges only added to the family's pain. During the inevitable media hype surrounding the arrest and trial, Frank feared his children wouldn't survive it. The divorce was a mere formality. Legally, Meredith could no longer be dead, but she would spend the next 12 years of her life in Arendelle State Prison. The International Marketing Corporation, of course, demanded that Frank return not only Meredith's life insurance policy, but also most of her 401k, since it was funded by bonuses she hadn't earned. As the innocent party, Frank may have had reason to keep some of the funds, but he wanted nothing to do with any part of his ex-wife's money. Instead, he began urgently looking for work as his family's savings were nearly depleted. The offer he received from a large aerospace company was coveted, not only because it allowed him to provide for his family, but also because it meant moving across the country. There were too many reminders of Meredith in Atlanta, and too many questions from friends and others that he and his children couldn't answer. Finding a new place to live and work seemed like the best solution for all of them. Frank didn't want to leave the state where he and his children were born, but he was ready to embrace the Pacific Northwest and start a new life. They were fortunate enough to sell the house in Atlanta and buy a nice, albeit slightly smaller home in Seattle. Meredith had always wanted to live in a luxurious home, and Frank had settled for something a little more cozy. The kids seemed to like it too, and they'd already made friends at the new school. He entered the house from the terrace and looked around for his car keys. Finding them, he poked his head into the kitchen to look for his wife. "Come on, Angel, let's go get our kids." Celia smiled happily at him. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.